Welcome to the Plain Faith Podcast. The Plain Faith Podcast is a podcast about missionary aviation and the stories of missionary aviators who have taken seriously Jesus' command to go and make disciples of all nations and are using airplanes to be His witnesses at the ends of the earth. Thank you for joining us for this episode. Your host for today's show will be Jimmy Tidmore, who, in addition to hosting this podcast, is a pastor and a pilot residing with his family in what is known as the Rocket City, Huntsville, Alabama. He is very interested in promoting missionary aviation and helping prospective missionary pilots reach the mission field. And now, with these introductions out of the way, let's get started on another great episode of the Plain Faith Podcast.
Welcome to episode 0 of the Plain Faith Podcast. As you heard in the opening introduction, my name is Jimmy Tidmore, and I will be the host of this show. I do reside with my wife and my 2 children, a 9-year-old daughter and a 3-year-old son in what is known as the Rocket City, Huntsville, Alabama. I am the pastor of a church in town, and I have been a pilot since 1996, and I am currently working on my flight instructor certificate. But for now, that's enough about me. Let me tell you about the show. My plans for this podcast are that during each episode, we will discuss a variety of topics related to missions aviation, and more importantly, we will have exciting new guests on each episode who will tell us about their experiences as missionary aviators or as those working in support of missions aviation. Most of our guests will be missionary pilots who are currently on the mission field. We will get to hear their stories and learn about the path they took to become a missionary pilot in the first place. We will discuss their training and their calling and the organization they are working with. And really, the stories are going to be the focus of this show. I am a pastor, and my congregation will tell you that I tend to talk a lot. But on this show, I'm going to do my best to simply get out of the way and let the stories flow. So why start a show like this? Well, one purpose of this podcast is to educate and inform our listeners about the ins and outs of missionary aviation, in order to simply bring about better awareness of what these men and women are doing around the world. A second purpose of this podcast is to encourage and inspire young men and women to consider whether or not missions aviation is something God is calling them to, and to give them information about how they can begin this journey, if that is indeed where God is leading them. I want to point young men and women like that in the right direction, and maybe even help connect them with folks who are currently serving in these roles and can serve as mentors to the next generation. And another purpose of this podcast is to connect you, the listeners, with living and breathing men and women who are serving God in missions aviation around the world. I want to connect you with them and tell you how you can pray for them and encourage them and support them as they obediently serve God in faraway places that can be very difficult places to live. So how can you help? Well, right now, we are still a few weeks away from releasing our first episode. As I am recording this, it is early April 2017, and I am currently lining up interviews and getting the word out and setting up a website and so forth, but I do plan to release the first episode by the end of this month. And one way you can help support the show is by going ahead and subscribing to the podcast. You can do that by going to plainfaith.com, that's Plane, plainfaith.com, and heading to the episodes page and clicking on the subscribe button in the right column. Another way you can help the podcast is by sharing it with others. I have set up accounts on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. Please go follow those accounts and share them with your friends. I have been very pleased with the response so far. People really seem to be interested in hearing the stories we will be sharing. But if this podcast is going to be a success and make a real positive impact on missions aviation, I need your help getting the word out. So send folks to our website, send them to Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and do what you can do to get them to subscribe to the show. Finally, one last way you can help is by sending potential guests our way. If you know of any missionary pilots or anyone working in support of missionary aviation, please direct them to us. I'd love to set up a time for an interview and get them on the show. The truth is, I haven't met a missionary pilot yet who doesn't have a great story to tell. And again, that's what this show is all about. Missionary aviators and their stories. So thank you so much for joining me on this brief introductory episode. I hope that I have said enough to pique your interest and that you're going to head over to plainfaith.com right now to subscribe to the podcast. Like I said earlier, we should have our first episode out by the end of April, and I am planning at this point to release 2 episodes a month. So for now, let me close by wishing you grace and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. I look forward to talking with you again in the next few weeks. I hope that you have a happy Easter with your family. God bless.
Well, that's it for this episode. We thank you once again for listening. You can learn more about the podcast and subscribe to it by visiting plainfaith.com. That's Plane faith.com. You will also find links there to connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you are interested in becoming a patron of the show, you can do that as well by visiting patreon.com/plainfaith. And of course, Jimmy would love to hear from you personally. So feel free to email him at jimmy@plainfaith.com or by using the contact form on our website. Until next time, remember that God made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God.
The intro and outro music for the Plain Faith podcast is a song called Chipper by Kevin MacLeod. You can find his work at incompetech.com.